Greetings and welcome back to gettingtotheroots.com. In today's video, we're discussing a critical topic, the Black Codes. The video title is Labor Trap: How Black Code Laws Enforced New Forms of Slavery. The Black Codes were a set of laws enacted by Southern states in the United States during 1865 and 1866 following the Civil War, and the states involved were Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, Virginia. Each crafted their own version of these oppressive laws. These laws had the intent and effect of restricting African Americans' freedom and compelling them to work in a labor economy based on low wages or debt. The main purpose of the Black Code laws was consistent with each state: to maintain white supremacy and control the labor and behavior of African Americans. The goal was to restore, as closely as possible, the pre-emancipation system of race relations. From labor contracts binding freedmen to relentless work cycles to astounding restrictions on basic civil rights. We're going to dissect the 10 harrowing laws that were designed to perpetuate a form of slavery, even after emancipation. But it wasn't just the South. The northern states had their own set of laws and practices. While they didn't formalize the Black Codes as the South did, racial prejudice and discrimination were still deeply ingrained in society. In the North, the struggle for equality was more about breaking down societal barriers and less about dismantling legalized oppression. What's fascinating and deeply troubling is how these Black Code laws varied dramatically from state to state in the South. Each state tailored these laws to maintain a semblance of control over African American lives, revealing the complexity and the regional nuances of racial oppression post-Civil War. As we journey through each of these laws, we'll uncover how they shaped the South's social and legal landscape and their lasting impact on America's journey toward true freedom. So, stay with us as we explore this critical chapter in American history. If you find value in this video, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. Let's dive in. Understanding the Black Codes. How did post-Civil War legislation affect freed African Americans? 1. Labor contracts. After the Civil War, Southern states quickly moved to control the labor of newly freed African Americans. Labor contract laws were a key tool in this endeavor. These laws required freedmen to sign annual labor contracts, primarily with white landowners, often their former masters. The contracts included terms that were heavily skewed in favor of the employer, such as long hours, minimal wages, and clauses that severely limited the worker's freedom to leave the employment or seek better terms elsewhere. The insidious nature of these contracts was their legal enforcement. Freedmen who refused to sign could be arrested for vagrancy, another aspect of the Black Codes. This created a coercive environment where African Americans had little choice but to agree to unfair labor terms. The contracts were a means to perpetuate a system of labor exploitation, effectively continuing the economic dynamics of slavery under a different name. Each Southern state had its own version of these laws, creating a patchwork of regulations that all served the same purpose: to bind African Americans to the land and to their former masters. The various laws varied depending on the economic and social priorities of each state, but they all represented an effort to undermine the freedom that emancipation had promised. 2. Vagrancy laws. Vagrancy laws formed a critical part of the Black Codes, targeting African Americans who were unemployed or without a fixed residence. These laws were intentionally vague, giving local authorities wide discretion to define what constitutes vagrancy. The result was a legal tool that could be used to criminalize a wide range of behaviors, effectively turning the state of being unemployed into a crime for African Americans. Once accused of vagrancy, the penalties were severe. Individuals could be fined, and, unable to pay these fines, they were often forced into labor, sometimes for the person or entity that had accused them of vagrancy. This system created a cycle of exploitation and abuse where African Americans could be perpetually trapped in a state of forced labor. The vagrancy laws varied from state to state, with some being more aggressive in their enforcement. In all cases, however, they served to re-enslave African Americans in all but name. The laws also discouraged migration and kept a stable, easily exploitable labor force available for plantation owners and other white employers. 3. Apprenticeship Laws. Apprenticeship laws under the Black Codes were ostensibly designed to provide vocational training to African American children, especially orphans. However, in practice, these laws were manipulated to force children into labor. White employers, often former slave owners, were given custody of black children under the guise of providing them with vocational training. In reality, these children were used as a source of cheap labor. These apprenticeship agreements were heavily one-sided. The children were bound to their masters until they reached adulthood, with few rights and little recourse to change their situation. The conditions they lived and worked in were often harsh and exploitative, closely mirroring the conditions of slavery. The variation in these laws from state to state did not significantly alter their core purpose: to create a legally sanctioned system of labor exploitation. While some states may have had more oversight or slightly more lenient terms, the overall effect was to deny African American children their freedom and to use them as a labor resource. 4. Restrictions on land ownership and residency. Restrictions on land ownership and residency were key components of the Black Codes, designed to control the economic prospects and mobility of African Americans. These laws limited the types of property that freedmen could own, often restricting them to rural or less economically valuable land. In many cases, African Americans were barred from purchasing or leasing land in urban areas or regions that were deemed more economically prosperous. These restrictions ensured that African Americans remained an agricultural labor force, tied to the land and dependent on white landowners. The ability to own property is a fundamental aspect of economic independence, and by limiting this ability, the Black Codes effectively kept African Americans in a subservient economic position. The specifics of these restrictions varied by state, reflecting the different economic landscapes and priorities of each region. However, the overarching goal was the same: to limit the economic freedom and mobility of African Americans and to maintain a social order that was reminiscent of slavery. These laws were a clear attempt to undermine the economic foundations of African American freedom and autonomy. 5. Restrictions on civil rights. The Black Code severely limited the civil rights of African Americans. One of the most egregious aspects was the denial of the right to vote. Many Southern states imposed literacy tests, poll taxes, and other barriers specifically designed to disenfranchise African American voters. The right to serve on juries was also denied, stripping African Americans of their voice in the legal system and perpetuating a justice system heavily biased against them. Moreover, these laws often included provisions that prohibited African Americans from testifying against white individuals in court. This legal inequality created an environment where the rights of African Americans were subordinate to those of white citizens. The laws varied from state to state, but they collectively worked to undermine the citizenship rights of African Americans and to maintain the pre-Civil War racial hierarchy. The restrictions on civil rights went beyond voting and legal representation. In many states, there were laws that regulated the freedom of assembly for African Americans, further limiting their ability to organize and advocate for their rights. These laws were not only a direct assault on the basic civil liberties of African Americans, but also a tool to maintain control and prevent any form of resistance or advancement. 6. Legalized discrimination. Legalized discrimination was a hallmark of the Black Codes, with laws enforcing racial segregation in both public and private spaces. These laws institutionalized a system of separate and unequal treatment, covering aspects of life ranging from education and employment to transportation and housing. The segregation laws under the Black Code laid the groundwork for the later Jim Crow laws. They mandated separate facilities for African Americans and whites, often with the former being of significantly lower quality. This legal segregation reinforced the notion of white supremacy and perpetuated the social and economic disparities between the races. Each Southern state had its form of legalized discrimination, reflecting local attitudes and social norms. However, the unifying theme across these laws was the intent to keep African Americans in a subordinate position, both socially and economically. The impact of these laws was far-reaching, laying the foundation for systemic racial inequalities that would persist for decades. 7. Punishments for breaking labor contracts. The Black Codes were strict about enforcing labor contracts. Freedmen who left their employment before the end of their contract could face severe penalties, including fines, arrest, and forced labor. This was a tactic to ensure a stable and controlled labor force, with African Americans having little freedom to change their employment situation. In many cases, breaking a labor contract was criminalized, equating a civil matter with a criminal offense. This not only reinforced the power of employers over their workers, but also used the legal system as a tool to bind African Americans to their jobs. The specifics of these punishments varied by state, but they universally served to restrict the mobility and economic freedom of African Americans. These laws also discouraged African Americans from seeking better employment opportunities or negotiating better terms, effectively maintaining the economic status quo of the antebellum South. The message was clear. African Americans were not to aspire beyond their assigned roles in the Southern economy. 8. Fines for unemployment. Under the Black Codes, being unemployed was not just a social issue but a legal one. African Americans who could not prove employment were subject to fines. This law effectively criminalized unemployment among African Americans, forcing them into any available job, regardless of the conditions or pay. The impact of this law was twofold. Firstly, it provided a steady supply of cheap labor to white employers, as African Americans were compelled to accept any work to avoid fines. Secondly, it served as a mechanism to control the African American population, keeping them economically dependent and socially subordinate. The severity of these fines and the rigor with which they were enforced varied from state to state. However, the underlying intent was consistent: to limit the economic freedom of African Americans and to ensure their continued exploitation in the Southern economy. 9. Restrictions on assembly and bearing arms. The Black Codes also included laws that restricted the right of African Americans to assemble and bear arms. These laws were designed to suppress any potential for organized resistance or self-defense among the African American population. By controlling these fundamental rights, Southern states aimed to maintain a social order that was reminiscent of the slavery era. The restrictions on assembly meant that African Americans could not gather for meetings, religious services, or any form of community organization without facing the threat of legal repercussions. This effectively stifled African American community life and hindered their ability to organize for their rights. Similarly, the laws regarding bearing arms were targeted specifically at African Americans. These laws were intended to disarm the African American population, leaving them vulnerable and unable to defend themselves against violence and intimidation.
The enforcement of these laws varied, but they played a crucial role in maintaining the power imbalance between the races. 10. Caste systems. In some southern states, the Black Codes included a pass system that controlled the movement of African Americans. Under this system, African Americans were required to have written permission from their employers to travel, even for short distances. This system was reminiscent of the passes used during slavery and was a clear attempt to control and limit the freedom of movement of African Americans. The pass system served several purposes. It reinforced labor contracts, as employers could deny passes to workers, effectively binding them to their place of work. It also served as a mechanism for surveillance and control, ensuring that African Americans remained within prescribed boundaries. The variation in the enforcement of the pass system reflected the local economic and social priorities. However, the overarching effect was to restrict the freedom of African Americans and to remind them of their subordinate status in the post-Civil War South. Each of these Black Codes represented a facet of the systematic attempt to control and oppress African Americans in the post-Civil War era. While the specifics varied from state to state, the intent behind these laws was consistent across the South: to maintain a social and economic order that closely resembled slavery. As we reach the end of our deep dive into the Black Codes, it's clear that these laws represent a significant and troubling part of American history. They highlight the challenges faced in the journey towards equality and the resilience of those who fought against these oppressive measures. Understanding this part of our past is crucial to shaping a more equitable future. If you found this video informative and enlightening, please help us share this knowledge with a wider audience. Your interaction greatly assists with the YouTube algorithm, so if you could take a moment to like this video if you found it valuable, share it with friends, family, or anyone you think would be interested in this important part of history. Comment below with your thoughts, insights, or any questions you might have. We love hearing from you and fostering a community of learning and discussion. And of course, subscribe or visit gettingtotheroots.com for more content like this. Your support is what enables us to continue creating educational and thought-provoking videos. Together, we can ensure that more people have access to this crucial information, helping to spread awareness and understanding of our shared history. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you in our next video. Peace and love.